There was a statehood vote, again, a couple of weeks ago. I think our audience, if you don't already know, we've talked about statehood on the show before. But what I found fascinating about that vote, looking at it a little bit more closely, was that the independence movement has gained steam at a time when, you know, it seems like the normie Democrats or, you know, and even Robert Reich is calling for statehood, not necessarily understanding the complexities and really what it would take to get the island there, but also, you know, wouldn't it be great if the island could decide for themselves? So what's your take on the performance of the independence movement?
Well, I mean, the election that we just had in Puerto Rico actually would put in a lot of younger progressives into, you know, our form of government, and as well as elected the first Black Puerto Rican lesbian as well. What happens with these plebiscites is the people of Puerto Rico don't go out. They sit out the plebiscite because we've had so many of them and they absolutely mean nothing. And this year there was a lot of money, like the last one before, put towards statehood, right? But what it is the general voting pattern of Puerto Ricans is in the high 90s. But we've had the hurricane, then the coronavirus, but still a lot of people came to vote. And actually right now there's a major recount happening. And I'm sorry about there's a major recount happening. I was watching some footage last night and, you know, the recount, I mean, people were throwing hands at each other. There was people trying to take that they didn't know votes and put them somewhere else. And there's a lot of corruption in the Puerto Rican government. Then you coupled with colonialism. But within all that, you know, there has been this whole now, particularly white liberals, yeah, Puerto Rico, they could be a state. Well, the only reason they want it is for our votes. I make it very clear, Puerto Rico will never be a state. I never say anything definitively like that. It will never happen. No fantasy of Democrats wanting 5.6 million Puerto Rican votes here. There's more Puerto Ricans in the United States than they are in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, you can't vote for the president. And really the mindset in Puerto Rico right now is one of self-determination and independence. And the two parties that usually go back and forth were also, you can see the numbers came down. And when you talk to a lot of younger Puerto Ricans, they're like, we don't want any party to exist. We're on a path to undo colonialism and try to get this in front of the United Nations so we can achieve some type of independence, which a transition would take very long anyway, you know, but that whole, you know, people just finding out that Puerto Ricans are important. I found it interesting because if you look at Pennsylvania, there's over 400,000 Puerto Ricans there. Nobody talked about them being a potential swing. Let's look at Florida. Well, everybody was caught up and the Republicans did all their scare media tactics about socialism and communism, targeting a very old white Cuban community that's still mad about Fidel Castro and the revolution, that they didn't focus on 1.4 million people that are Puerto Ricans. They could have flipped the state. And I'm not a Democrat. I'm just saying politically, you could have flipped the state of Florida really quickly because 84% of the Puerto Ricans in Florida that voted did vote for Biden and Harris. So, and
that's we begin because just to touch on that, what I find so fascinating, you mentioned it sort of casually, but it's a huge deal. The island is extremely politically active.
Yes.
90% of the island turns out and votes. It's a highly educated island. I think there's more lawyers in Puerto Rico than any other state in America, which is, look at New York. I mean, that's pretty mind-boggling. It is a very civically active island. And with that, there aren't a traditional two-party system. So when you say things like the youth don't find the two parties any interest in them, it's not just Democrats versus Republicans, which is a mainland thing.
Yeah.
It's the parties in the island which were really defined around whether or not they support statehood or not, or what the path to for the island is. A conversation.
Or the Commonwealth status. So
Exactly.
there's the progressive people's party, which is not that progressive. Then you have the Independistas, and there's a lot of issues around there of race and gender that has really not allowed young people to like fully come as themselves into the Independista movement. I mean, it's a bunch of mostly
sounds like
old,
socialism.
yeah,
like it's the same. It's the same tale like everywhere.
like old white men are still running it, and you know, it is in Puerto Rico, voting is man. It's like if you don't go vote, people in your neighborhood would be like, "Why are you here?" It's a day off, you know, like people take it seriously. And that's why I look at Florida, I look at Pennsylvania, I look at Minneapolis. There are Puerto Ricans everywhere in this country, but in some type of numbers. And this is true for the Dominican community in Rhode Island. Those are the swing voters, you know, not the working class, which you're really trying to get white men back from Trump. I don't know why, you know, but that I was like, I can't believe no one went to Florida. Like Biden and Harris went and met with the Cubans.
Oh, I mean, I'm sorry, like, Luis Fonsi didn't turn the...
No. No, that Bunny didn't come out.
The Despacito.
No. Well, the thing is, that would have worked. If they had just been like, well, let's pay some attention and understand this 5.6 million voting bloc that, of course, is not a monolith, but is surely more on the progressive side of things.
So let's talk a little bit about the establishment, the mainland establishment's ties to the island when it comes to what Naomi Klein coined as disaster capitalism and the financial interests that already existed, you know, with the economic crisis there. I mean, they've existed forever. I shouldn't say that. There were pharmaceutical companies coming into the island. There's a great history of true colonialism since forever, since Columbus arrived, right? But I think what I find so fascinating about this moment, intertwined with the statehood conversation in the Democratic Party, is how many officers of the Democratic Party have vested interests in, they either represent financial ties or real estate companies that are really taking advantage of the island at its most vulnerable point. You know, after financial collapse, after Hurricane Maria, now with COVID, there just seem to be these vultures that are swooping in, and they're connected to the Democratic Party too.
Yeah, I mean, it really, we were already facing a high debt because of the economy falling in 2008. You know, that what happened here also happened there in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico in general, in any statistic, if Mississippi is the 50th and we were a state, we'd be 51. The average Puerto Rican makes poverty makes $18,000 a year. Okay, so there were already a lot of issues. And then when Barack Obama signed the Promesa bill, which promised paying the debt, or that the debt would also go to bondholders, even though there were Puerto Ricans, many of my comrades that, you know, talked to the Democrats, talked to Nydia Velasquez, talked to so many Democrats, Congresswoman.
Oh, independence.
Right? She is. I think that's a little bit of the AOC effect. And AOC wasn't in there. I'm sure she would have fought that hard. But it also was boistered at that time by Lin-Manuel Miranda's father, who obviously everybody knows Lin through Hamilton, but his father has been a really big power broker in New York around the Democratic Party. And the Hispanic Federation, they testified on behalf of Promesa. So then here comes the hurricane, and then this ballooning of the debt. And what it is that there are people that are making the decisions, much like in Flint and some other places where a mayor does not make the budget, or it's a different group of people. That's what's happening. And so anything that Puerto Rico makes goes right to the debt. And there are 7 people, mostly all in New York, lawyers who sit and make those decisions. And one of them was to close over 200 schools in less than 3 years. The person who did that is a close friend of Betsy DeVos. 6 months ago, her and 30 people from the education committee got arrested by the FBI because they were taking all the money that was supposed to go to the schools, keeping it and shutting schools down. So in Puerto Rico right now, we're in a critical juncture if we can maintain the island as an island for Puerto Ricans, because now we also have the bit currency, like young,
right.
What's his name that ran for president?
Brock.
Yeah.
Let's get to that in a second, because but I want to touch a little bit more on the education stuff, because when I was a reporter on the island in 2018, sorry, I have to do the math, 17, 18, after the storm, I interviewed the Secretary of Education on the island, who, speaks fluent Spanish, but she's from Pennsylvania, and she's a white woman, and there was just such an there was a lot of pushback against her publicly, with the press. She was very closed off from folks. And I sat down and I interviewed her, and she stormed off in the middle of the interview when I asked her very basic questions like, how is the solution to the education crisis to shut down 200 schools on an island that's, it's larger than Long Island, and a lot of it's rural. And so if you live in Utuado, for instance, or like in the mountains somewhere, and your child has to go 2.5 hours to school every day because they're shut down schools. Mm-hmm. How is that solving the problem? And it was just really fascinating to see her perspective on it. But let's also be very clear, she is a Betsy DeVos ally, but she also is an ally of the governor, who aligns with the Democratic Party, who's no longer there, right? Also booted out.
Well, Rosa Joe aligned with the Republican Party. If he was in a line, if there was...
on the mainland. On the mainland, he cozied up to Tom Perez.
To Trump, and But, he did with both, But he was corrupt, and which is why we had the protests that forced him to resign. And then now you see all the scandals. And unfortunately, Puerto Ricans are used to that. But what's been happening on the island is just like young people are just now, first they're pushing back on this dude, Brock Turner, right?
Brock Pierce. So Brock Pierce.
I just know he ran. I didn't even know he was on the ballot, honestly, until
he ran for president.
I know.
So wait, let's say background. Another part of my reporting that was really fascinating, and I will release this on our channel. It never aired at TYT, but I will. I was embedded with them for a week or something, because they thought that they were gonna win over the TYT audience because they're cool, and they meditate, and they do yoga on the beach, and they have sushi parties, and they wear crazy. It was the what's that festival in Nevada that everybody goes to? The Burning Man. Burning Man crew. Yeah. They're actually part of the organizers, founders were part of it. But they were they went down there. These are Bitcoin guys, and okay, so that's this. I'll set the stage with that I will release that someday. But tell everybody what they've been doing on this. It's maddening.
So what it is that as an American citizen, you could have an address in Puerto Rico and try to show you lived there 151 days out of 356, and you don't have to pay federal taxes, right? So now with the cryptocurrency, what they did is basically a bunch of white dudes created what they thought would be their own city. Naomi Klein brilliantly discusses this, called Protopia. And it was going to be in between Isla Verde and Old San Juan, which is Santurce, which is the heart of part of our African descendant community, but it's a very much part of the socialist and artistic people of Puerto Rico. And he continues to get run out. And actually, the day before voting, this is how the election here, I was watching one of my friends, and he's like, "That's him, Brock Pierce. We're about to roll up on him." And I'm like, why? Why is he in New York City? What's that? And he's like, he's on the ballot. I'm like, what ballot? I didn't even know. But of course, Puerto Ricans were shaming him, but unfortunately, because of austerity measures, because there hasn't been a full audit of the debt, because there's so much corruption, this is the type of opportunities that people like him will take. There are people going down there just taking land because our people this is a very Caribbean thing. In our communities, we don't necessarily remember deeds or get deeds. And post a hurricane,
right.
People lost everything. So the banks are like, if you don't show your deed, you don't own the house. You could prove you've been living there 60, 70 years. And that happened to my family, which is why my uncle went down there right before the hurricane to stay in our family house and is still there because the banks come, people are coming with cash. Unfortunately, so many businesses have closed. I mean, if somebody, you're suffering, somebody's like, here's $75,000 and ticket to Florida, which is now the hub of migration for Puerto Ricans, because no Puerto Rican is going to mostly go to Chicago, New York because of rent. So, and Florida keeps you very closer to the island, you know? So it's a lot, but yeah.
And with the deeds, just to touch on that, because I just to put more context into it. So folks will inherit their family property, right? And they never, their grandparents don't sign over a deed. And so some folks would talk about how the deeds were from like 1922 and, their grandparents, their great grandparents were no longer alive. And so there was like this limbo land where they couldn't protect their own property because of the way that, they were keeping records essentially.
Yeah.
Is that's fair enough?
No, that's exactly what happened. I mean, that's what happened in my family. So, that's the norm. And the flip side of all of this is that there is now such an incredible intergenerational movement that first is a conscious movement. And one thing that Hurricane Maria brought to light was anytime I would go to the island, I talk about independence with people, they'd be like, no, what would we do without the federal government? What would we do without the United States? Well, when Donald Trump threw paper towels, we exactly knew what we could do for ourselves. So the hurricane changed the consciousness of people who were like statehooders or Commonwealth in like a week, like, no, do for self. It's so funny you mentioned Utuado, because when I went down there with the crew I put together, we went to Utuado first, and the people there were like, we're not leaving. We don't care if there's one slab of concrete. We are not going anywhere. But then you have now younger people that were born and raised here in the United States who are repatriating back to Puerto Rico, building farms, and using renewable energy because it's an island. We could be the first kind of like representation of what does it look like to be 100% renewable energy sources. We're an island. The sad part right now is because of climate catastrophe, we've had earthquakes in Puerto Rico. That's not
something that's common, right?
Oh, it's not. No, I mean, I'm not talking about one earthquake. There's been 13 recorded earthquakes. The electrical grid still, whoever keeps changing what business, it stays corrupt. So there's rolling blackouts.
Right.
But, like compared to not seeing folks here really dig deep into like, are you really going to think Biden and Harris are going to change anything where everybody's just kind of like, oh, you're cool, party, the Dems won. In Puerto Rico, they're like top to bottom changing all of that. And mutual aid, self-determination, farming, taking over the schools, rebuilding the schools, going to the university and be like, I'm not even paying tuition. Period.
Oh yeah, this is amazing. I mean, there's always been extraordinary activism on the island, but like because it's been ignored so much and the crisis is so intensified, so much bigger than like we can even imagine in the mainland in January, February, when everyone's facing mass evictions. I mean, it's every man for himself, which actually turns into a community thing, mutual support. I think that the aspect of the farms, I went to a few of these farms, really amazing farms where, like you said, people who came back or were young folks, young parents on the island that moved from San Juan into a farm. The aspect of that that's really fascinating is because of colonial interests and the Jones Act too, everything is very expensive on the island. It's like the cost of New York City, but on an island because you're taxed on both ends, importing and exporting, right? But the farmland, I mean, there should be this thriving, coffee, bananas, but the colonial, I think it was like the early 1900s, if I'm correct, if I recall, you correct me if I'm wrong, they swiped in and they just ruined all the farms. So Puerto Ricans were dependent on importing.
Right.
And it's horrifying because the remaining farms are just a remnant of what existed. So it's beautiful to see young people coming back and nurturing the land and really investing in their homeland.
Yeah, and part of it too is obviously we should be able to eat the food we grow, but because we've lost so many doctors because of the United States government not reimbursing Puerto Rico for Medicaid payments for years now, a lot of these young people are becoming healers as well. And, I think that's very important in these times of technology, and that what actually ends up to be a revolution or healing is land, being able to feed yourself, being able to use our indigenous, our African, our healing powers, because some residents could be 80 miles outside of a hospital.
Yeah.
Because so many hospitals have closed. So, I think what we're seeing in Puerto Rico, I would like to see that kind of replicated here in the US, as opposed to depending on Biden and Harris, who have just shown and you did an excellent take, just broke it down. But Cedric Richmond, he's a disgraced congressman. Really, like, you're going to talk to Larry Summers? Is this, and look, again, I am not a two-party person, people. I endorse Bernie, I endorsed Bernie and I voted green. All I'm saying is, they're already saying, we don't care what y'all want. Mm-hmm. Okay, young people, thank you, Black women, for 92% of you voting. That's why we won. Thank you, young people. Thank you, Bernie, young folks. Literally, like you said, less than 1 week, this is a shit show already. Oh, sorry.
They're not even faking it. They're not even faking it.
Yeah.
That's what's,
I really apologize for that.
Oh, don't worry.
Yeah, it's so I'm really glad you're breaking it down every day. I've been watching the show, and it's just, you make it that is so understandable and relatable, because part of what they're going to do, as any administration, is also have a little confusion by throwing in like a progressive here and there, where we're like, oh, I know they're good, but you can't be good and then 800 bad. Right? It's not like going to balance it out.
You're right. That's ultimately it. Even if you have a labor secretary that's progressive, you're still operating within the rules and the confines of an administration that has, the majority of the administration is made up of corporate interests that are adverse to labor. Look at the transition teams, all gig economy people. Gig economy people that we were protesting like a minute ago, and now we're suddenly, it's okay. We got Uber, we got Facebook, because Larry Summers and Sheryl Sandberg are our besties. So even though Facebook delivered us Trump.
Yeah, and I found another reason to fall in love with AOC. When she was very clear last week at the New York Times, like, I don't know if I could be in this too much longer. And you're like, girl, you've been in there 2 years. This is, the difference of running, being elected, and then actually governing. And although they have this great name, the Squad, what that really means is those 4 sisters, and I would put Katie Porter up in there too. She's destroying it during every hearing. They're the 5 that have now been marginalized by the so-called progressives in the party, right? Mm-hmm. So for an AOC to be like, this might not be what I thought it could be, I think will be very interesting to see what she does next, because I know she's in there fighting, but come on, we know what the Democratic Party is about. And we saw how they treated them during the campaign. You didn't bring them out ever. You just sidelined them. They're the reason that young people are even having any semblance of hope in the electoral politics of our country. So I'm thinking that I want to know your take one day. You'll say it on the show.
I'll save that for one of my
analysis. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's real. My concern with constantly turning our heroes into heroes, like with a capital H, is we say things like go run against Schumer, and they're thinking, oh, that's a great opportunity for us to get rid of her because she can get out of Congress, and then we can play our games that we do with everybody. And Schumer can stay in power or whoever. So we always have to be very careful about that stuff because they're thinking 55 steps ahead of us. And we are a movement that's just trying to catch up with the pace of society and organize. But you've been doing this forever. Rosa Clemente, I am so grateful to have you on the show. Would love to have you back on. It seems like everyone's loving you too. So
no, I mean, anytime. I'm so glad you did this and then gave me the impetus to try to start my own. But in no way can I break this analytically down the way you do. And I appreciate that, and to your audience. And I'm signing up right now to make sure I'm a Patreon, right? That's what I call myself. Yeah. And thank you. Yeah, it's fine. That's what I do. We need truth tellers, and we need you. So thank you.
Thanks for watching and listening to the Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.